Method of movement is the definitive guide for Stephen's technique on the marimba. Now, when playing double vertical strokes, the book mentions a concept called wrist pop. This is what it looks like. You see, as the mallet heads go down, the wrist moves upward, as opposed to this sort of motion where the wrist doesn't move upward. Now, the author, Lee Howard Stevens, has since said that wrist pop is kind of a bad description of it, because the words wrist pop sounds like you've dislocated something, or something like that. A better word, he said, would perhaps be wrist reaction, and that's exactly what it is. It should feel completely comfortable and completely natural. I didn't learn about wrist reaction until a couple years after I started playing. Before, I just had my wrist still like that. And I didn't immediately understand why wrist reaction was beneficial. However, I've since integrated it into my double vertical strokes, and I think I understand why now. And my theory on why comes down to moment of inertia. Moment in physics is a concept that's kind of similar to a force. You're probably familiar with a force. If you push something, then you're applying a force to it. And when you apply a force, then the object you're pushing is going to move in that direction. A moment is the same thing, but for rotation. It's kind of like a force for rotation. So if I take this folder here and I rotate it about this pivot point, then I'm applying a moment on the folder. There's another way to apply a moment, and that is by applying a force at a distance away from the pivot point. If I apply a force in line with the pivot point, it's just going to move the object like a normal force. But if I apply the force at a distance away from the pivot point, you can see it'll rotate. The distance from the pivot point at which the force is applied is very important. You can feel this yourself by trying to shut a door. So a door rotates about its hinges, right? The hinges are the pivot point. And if you go to the opposite side of the door and try and shut it closed, it's pretty easy to shut it. But if you move that force closer to the pivot point, then all of a sudden the door is a lot harder to close. So that tells us when you apply the force at a greater distance from the pivot point, it's a lot easier to apply the moment. I like to think of moment of inertia as that same concept in reverse. So I'm going to cut out these two circles out of cardboard to show you what I mean. So here I'm applying the moment on the small circle, and it's pretty nice, pretty easy to rotate. When I try and apply the moment on the bigger circle, you can see it takes a lot more effort to get it moving at the same speed. That's because there's more mass further away from the pivot point on the larger circle. And since the mass is further away from the pivot point, it takes more energy to get it rotating. So again, moment of inertia, I think of it as the reverse of moment, because the further away the mass is, the harder it is to apply the moment. So let's bring this back to marimba. When you're making a stroke, the mass that you're moving is the mass of the mallet heads. So this is the mass. And without wrist reaction, the pivot point is where the forearm ends right there. If you do use wrist reaction, the pivot point moves kind of to the center of the wrist. And you can see there, the pivot point is closer to the mass. That means there's a smaller moment of inertia when you're using wrist reaction versus not using wrist reaction. And it wasn't obvious to me at first because I wasn't used to it, but once I got comfortable with it and integrated it into my stroke, the wrist reaction stroke does feel a lot better than the non-wrist reaction stroke. This just feels easier. And because it feels easier, it's not going to use as much energy, and you're not going to get tired as easily. Because when you're playing marimba all day and you're making, I don't know, tens of thousands of strokes on the instrument, that tiny difference in energy is really going to add up over time. So to practice that motion, if you don't have it down already, just stay relaxed, stay loose. You can take your finger to visualize your pivot point and just get a feel for how your wrist moves upward like that. And then once you have the mallets in your hand, it'll be a nice balance between your wrist and the mallets.